from the University of Birmingham, Dr. Laura Dillon-Pio, who's going to speak to us about education against extremism and philosophy for children today. So, welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's really lovely to be here and lovely to see all of you. And I already have a sense that you've got some really wonderful ideas, and we're hoping to learn from you and hear from you just as much as we will be sort of sharing some of our thoughts and ideas. And I say we because this particular presentation is a project that Michael Hand and I have started working on this year. So prior to this year, I was a senior lecturer in philosophy in Western Australia, and I also am the chairperson for the Federation of Australasian Philosophy in Schools Association. So my background is in philosophy and in philosophy in schools, as well as a bit of public philosophy. And I moved to the UK at the start of the year to start a position at Birmingham in philosophy of education. And what I'm really loving is I'm closer to the community in Europe, and I know that in Ireland there is a lot of support for philosophy in schools, and that's really great. So I think you guys are probably, world leading in that regard. And so it's wonderful to see the ethical education curriculum and what you're doing with that. And I think a lot of the strategies that are suggested in the curriculum are very sympathetic and go hand in hand with some of the P4C pedagogical techniques and practices. And so just to get a bit of a sense, actually, how many of you are familiar with P4C or Philosophy for Children or the Community of Inquiry? How many of you have tried it out yourselves? Leave your hands up if you use any of those techniques. So some of you have, some of you haven't. That's great. I wasn't going to sort of spell out some of the actual concept games and community of inquiry and techniques that we use or anything like that, but I have shared some resources with the organisers of the conference, and so they'll be able to share them with you. And honestly, like anything else, it's just, here's some interesting ideas. You may already be familiar with them. Some of them might give you some other thoughts and ideas that you can adapt them to, your own age-appropriate classrooms if you like or if you're interested. But if you want to talk more about those, come and talk to me in the break or at the dinner tonight. But what I thought that I would do is talk about this project that Michael and I are starting on. We're at the early stages of it, and so we are really interested in your thoughts and your feedback. And we're starting with some of the conceptual work because we're philosophers, that's what we do. But then we're really interested in, as we continue on, some of the practical applications and some of the what this might look like in schools if there's things that we can do using, for example, things like dialogue and other techniques. I'll be linking it more to P4C because that's my background and experience, but again, really open to hearing your ideas on this. But because we have been sitting and talking and thinking and we've had a short break, I think that we need to get moving just a little bit. And teachers love it. Like, they do this in their own classes, but when you say, let's all do something like this, they all groan and they're like, no, you're one of those, can't stand it. But what I thought we'd do is we'd play a little game where we're going to be able to jump up. I don't know if you all know each other or not. So I'm going to invite you to jump up and travel to the other side of the room from wherever you are. Find someone that perhaps you don't know or don't know too well, and see if you can find 3 things that you have in common with them. When you find 3 things that you have in common, you sit down. When you're sitting down and you see another couple that are sitting down, go and join up with them, and as a group of 4, see if you can find 3 things that you all have in common. When you've found 3 things that you have in common, sit down. And when you see another group of 4, and so the idea is that if we had enough time, we'd maybe be able to find 3 things that all of us have in common all together. But we'll see how we go. We'll just do this for 5 minutes. So I invite you to jump up, go and find someone, find 3 things in common. Okay, if I can have your attention again. Okay, sorry to interrupt you there, but if you can take your seats back again. Did anyone make it to a group of 8? Okay, I'd love to hear what 3 things your groups of 8 had in common. So, groups of 8, just hands up if you were in a group of 8.
Sorry. Someone at this table, you guys made it to a group of 8.
We were all teachers. We all speak English, and
Over 20.
we're over 20.
Very good. Was there anything different that people had in common in any of the other groups of 8?
Who was another group of 8? There was another group of 8. Mike, were you in a group of 8? 5.
We were a group of 8. We were quite certain.
We were going to get to We Love Nature. That was my plan anyway.
So, what other things did groups of 4 have in common?
We said we all liked to travel. We all liked red wine. And we had teachers as well, actually. That's the only same one.
Wonderful. A couple of other things?
Can I land at something?
I was in the same group as you were.
Brian?
We just said multi-denominational schools that we all taught in them. What else did we say? In our 2 we come up with that we like Guinness. I don't know, is there anything else? That was new.
I think
Dublin based.
Okay, so we've got a group where people have quite a few things in common. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this game is when you play it, when you might have quite a diverse group and seeing what comes out of that. Because there are a couple of interesting educational interventions that are trying to educate against extremism that I heard about recently when I went to Liverpool Hope University. And some of these ideas about tolerance and what we have in common are central themes to the work that they're doing. So the Liverpool World Centre, for instance, is using P4C and community inquiry to try and educate against extremism. And there's the Tolerance Project in a small town in Sweden, which is doing some really interesting work there, where they deliberately select individuals, students from very, very different backgrounds. So they might be different cultural, religious, and other kinds of backgrounds, even academic ability. And they have a shared experience where they'll come together. It might be a summer school or for a whole week, and in the end it involves a trip to one of the concentration camp sites, because this town in particular has a problem with some, young people becoming radicalised in the far right sort of neo-Nazi kind of thinking, and so they wanted to find radical interventions to get people to understand and tolerate and learn what they have in common. So there are some interesting things that are happening. But one of the things I think that drove Michael and I to look at this project is the idea that it seems to us that most educators will recognise that extremism and radicalisation is a very genuine, real problem, and what do we do about that? And there's lots of different suggestions. But we wanted to take that step back and have the starting point of, do we understand what we mean by extremism? Are we on the same page? And can schools actually be tasked with tackling or educating against something that we might call extremism? What actually is it? And one of the issues that comes up with this kind of word is that in different political or governmental documents, the word can be altered and changed, and sometimes it might, be because it specifically has, political ideas behind which word we're going to use in, at that time. So if we're referring to, for instance, some of the documents used to say violent extremism, then what work is the word extremism doing there? Are we just worried about the actions, the violence? Are we just worried about criminal behaviour? So it seems that the word is indicating something, but we would like to sort of get a clearer idea as to what it's indicating. And then that might help us to see whether or not there's something that educators can do in this domain. And so if we're going to say, yes, schools and educators do have some kind of role here in educating against extremism, then we're going to need a definition that helps us to try and understand extremist views as undesirable and in some way educationally remediable. And so whether or not we can get that from a definition is going to be interesting. And so what we'll do is we'll just go along and see if we can get this definition, but we'll challenge it along the way. So of course we're going to try and give controversial examples or objections and other points of view to see if our definition can withstand those objections. So firstly, worries about undesirability. Are extremist views, or is extremism in itself undesirable? I've got a couple of suggestions here, a couple of quotes. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? So the question is not whether we'll be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? And another one here, extremism in the defence of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. So it looks as though maybe sometimes extremism might be admirable. And again, I think I'll just pause for 2 seconds, well, maybe 2 minutes, and give you a chance to just tell the person next to you or at your table, do you think this is the case? Is there ever a case where extremism can be a good thing? Is this possible? So just 2 minutes, just very quickly, an initial thought on that. Okay, thank you. It's very effective, the power of the hand. I sort of want to sort of move on, but yeah, just show of hands. So do you think that extremism, hands up if you think, oh yeah, sometimes it could be a really positive thing. Is anyone convinced of that? Does someone who hasn't shared with us previously want to just maybe give a reason why they think that?
Hello. So what we were talking about, or what I mentioned, was that sometimes you need something to bounce off. So if somebody comes up with an extremist position, you have that kind of, that's the thesis, and then you have antithesis, and then hopefully you'll get to synthesis. That that an extremist position comes up, and then you counter that, and sometimes then a middle way is found through that.
Great, thank you. Was there anyone who thought that no, extremism can never be a good thing? It's always undesirable. Does anyone have that position?
Oh, Sean.
I'm not sure I have a lot of rationale for it, but we just picked a couple of examples in our 2-minute chat where, things that could seem really healthy at first, like fitness, exercise, when it goes to extreme levels, it's bad. Things like, I suppose, dieting, extreme dieting, we kind of went with ideas like that, or even ideologies. The more extreme your ideology gets, and the further down that road you get, seems to lead to people getting hurt. So that was, we didn't flesh it out much more than that, but we kind of thought the balance should be sought at all,
Yeah, and I think that's a great example there. And another one that we won't discuss right now, but worth considering is, can you have an extreme of love or care or compassion? Can that be too extreme? Is that even possible? So there's just, that is worth considering. So is extremism undesirable? Well, maybe not always. What about whether it's educationally remediable? Can we always do something in education to help prevent the undesirable kinds of extremism? If extremism is rooted in social structures and community relations, not in the knowledge, understanding, values and attitudes of learners, then it might be that we might not be very effective in the educational space. So in some of the research and literature on extremism that leads to radicalisation and terrorism, there's this quote here: "Lack of social inclusion and the rejection or marginalisation of minority groups by the mainstream in particular ways was felt to play a key role in creating the conditions that nurture radicalisation and extremism. In addition to marginalisation and social exclusion more broadly, specific examples or experiences of discrimination and racism for minority groups were keenly felt to be a driver for radicalisation and extremism." So if extremism is a social influence then, and rooted in features outside of the classroom, then it might not be that education can do much to help it. So again, just interested, 2 minutes, give your feedback to the rest of your table on that, whether or not you think education has a role to play here. Okay, is there one person who hasn't shared with us previously who would like to say something on this or address this worry? So the idea here is that maybe all the beliefs that are learnt that are extremists are outside of the classroom. Such students, for instance, could learn to talk the right talk. They could learn to not say what they know shouldn't, might sound extremist. They might prevent saying that kind of thing in the classroom. But education isn't going to affect the views that they've actually formed.
So we're just struggling with this question and the previous one because we haven't defined extremism. So we're just spending our time trying to figure out what extremism is first.
Yes, which is exactly what I'm trying to do as well. So I'll be giving you... So I'm going to be offering you a definition that Michael and I have come up with as a working definition. And what we're trying to do is see if this helps us, because one of the things we've noticed is that there are a lot of documents, not just for teachers and education, but in the government saying, oh, we should be worried about extremism, we should teach against it and prevent it happening. And then all these ways we might be able to do that. And yet it seems to be taken for granted what extremism is, or there might be different competing definitions of extremism, and we're not sure how helpful those definitions are. So I guess in promoting the conversation, I'm just sort of encouraging that question of the assumption, we might have used the word, but have we thought about what we think extremism is? Is it something that's undesirable? Is it something that's educationally remediable? Now, if there is a version of extremism that is undesirable and educationally remediable, then teachers might have a role that they can help with this. But just to say, these worries aren't insignificant. Double negative there, sorry. If extremism is actually unobjectionable or educationally unremediable, then the role of the teacher, the role of the moral educator, would be needless or pointless. So if that's the case, and there might be some versions of extremism that fall into this category. But getting onto the assumption that I think that we're probably starting at is that we do think of extremism generally as something bad, and that's something we can help to educate against in the classroom. And so if that's the case, if we can fortify children against this kind of way of thinking or acting, then we need to consider what that version of extremism is and what teachers might be able to do about it. So what we're doing here as philosophers is we're trying to get to the definition, to the root of the concept. And we're trying to find a definition that's going to be able to work and do this work that we need it to do. So we need to look at how the word is used, a descriptive definition, how it's used in common parlance, and whether or not we agree on that description. And then we need to think how it should be used. And so a lot of philosophy might seem sort of, you know, that it's not really connected to the real world when it's focusing just on trying to get a definition right. But if we can come up with a definition that is going to be both descriptive and stipulative, it can then say, okay, well, this is our starting point, we're on the same page. How does it guide what we do in the real world? What are we looking for? So this is what we're trying to do as our starting point, is get clear on the word. So in terms of the ordinary usage, we can go to the dictionary, and extremism is a tendency to be extreme, a disposition to go to extremes, the views or actions of extremists. An extremist is one who is disposed to go to the extreme, or who holds extreme opinions. Okay, that's tautological, it's helpful, it's great. Extreme of opinions, of fashions, going to the utmost extent, exceeding the limits of moderation, or of persons going to great length in any habit, action, disposition, or opinion. So with this dictionary definition, we can see that an extremist view is simply one that is not moderate. Now, is that undesirable? Should we educate against views that are not moderate? Is this what we're worried about? No. So, you know, there's lots of views where we say, well, maybe moderate view isn't the preferential view in that particular time or that particular context. This isn't helping us too much just yet. In the UK, they've come up with a document, the Homeland Security and the Defence Strategy has a document that actually includes teachers and schools as being a part of a defence strategy. So this is controversial. There's, you know, for the first time inscribed in the documents, a role for teachers to play. And there's lots of questions around that, as you can imagine, in the positioning of the teacher in that role anyway. But let's have a look at what their definition is. So in the Prevent duty in the UK, extremism is defined as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. And the fundamental British values, there's going to be 4 of them, include democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. So those are meant to be the fundamental British values. Now, whether or not they're British or not is another question. And also, the other question is how that is taught to students. Because there's, you know, even if there's citizenship education and students are all taught this, if you ask students who have supposedly had citizenship education, so if I ask my university students in Britain, what are the fundamental British values, quite a few of them will say things like, oh, we like tea, the Queen's nice, you know, things like this. So, you know, there's a whole set of questions about this anyway. But one of the big ones seems to be that on this definition, straight away, if you don't think that a liberal democracy is the best form of government, then you're an extremist. That's one example of a problem here. And there are, you know, it's a history of philosophy that, and obviously real world experiences that, you know, might be skeptical about how much, you know, a liberal democracy is the best form of governance. So is this our best definition for what extremism is? Is this going to be universal? Is this useful? Again, I might just give you just 1 minute. Just tell the person next to you or in the table with you what you think about this definition. Any thoughts on this? Is there any sympathy for this position? Is there anything that you think, you know, it's trying to get at something that's useful?
Sorry, is there anyone that hasn't spoken yet that wants to jump in? No? Okay.
So my initial is I disagree with it, and I find it hypocritical. But then actually within it, it says democracy, and British values. While it sounds like, oh, what should we all agree on the same thing? But what are values? Is it a way, like we were talking about, morals living together? And is that actually something that we should adhere to when we move to a country to try and understand the way a country, you know, I might have a different culture, but I should try and respect and integrate and understand the values and try and adhere on some level without becoming them. So actually, maybe it's not as bad as I first thought it was, because the rule of law, I mean, you do have to go with law. Individual liberty is actually quite a nice thing. Mutual respect, fair enough. They're not doing it, but yeah, I'd probably like to do it.
Thank you. Does anyone want to just briefly mention something that is problematic for them when they see this?
Well, just one small point about the rule of law. I think it's the rule of legitimate law. If you use that definition in a Northern Irish context, a couple of years ago, you could have had laws that were there that were quite discriminatory. And so I would say the rule of legitimate law. That's a great point. Thank you. Because again, of course, with Michael and my work, we're trying to focus on morality, and ideally morality will be enshrined in law and reflect what's moral. And that, of course, doesn't always happen, which is why laws need adjusting and changing.
No, it's just reading it just feels immediately like closed off, not welcoming, nationalist, not intercultural. You know, just an immediate reading of it. It doesn't feel open. It feels, this is it. There's no negotiation. There's no listening to other discussions. So it just feels closed.
Thank you. Yeah, I wonder if the word fundamental British values was removed, would it be more tenable to people? And because, of course, it might be that some of these are universal. They're not British. They're shared. So I think that, yeah, wording matters here. There's just one more comment and then I'll move on.
Sorry, one really quick one. But individual liberty just is a very Western value. It's very anti-collectivist. So maybe they're just not universal values in that sense.
And it comes back to what you said, and I think it's a really good point. The rule of law, like in countries like Saudi Arabia and stuff, that if you steal something, they can chop off your hand. Is that just because it's the rule of law of that country? Is that acceptable? And we would see that as extremist in forms of law. So I just think that's something for me very hard to deal with, as I see the whole statement as a contradiction for me, to be honest. Sorry.
That's great, thank you. Because what we wanted to say was that we're not on board with these definitions. They haven't given us the platform that we want to work with just yet. So the dictionary definitions and the UK government definitions isn't giving us the definition that is useful for us to educate against just yet. So in our quest for such an account, we want to have a look at if we can find a better definition than this. So here's an offering, a suggestion that is open for discussion and feedback. So on our definition, we think that we might have a couple of options. Now, we're not sure yet whether the definition has to hold both of these, as in they're mutually necessary and sufficient, or if there might be some examples where one and not the other holds. So this is something we're still looking at. But we seem to think that there might be something in it, that views are extremist if the content is in some way objectionable, or when the views are held too strongly with too much dogmatism, militancy, or certitude. So we want to investigate these. We're going to call them the objectionable content option and the excessive strength option. And we're going to see if these work. We're going to see if one or the other or both work. And of course, we'll throw some examples at them to see how they fare as well. So the starting point, the objectionable content option, which fits very well into the example that you just gave of chopping off someone's hand if they steal. The government's definition in the UK is of this kind of version, where they're saying, okay, if you don't agree with fundamental British values, then you're extremist because you've got objectionable content within your beliefs. We've said that this is a problem because we can see that there is room for reasonable doubt, and you've pointed out maybe about some specific laws, or historically some specific laws, but also political values of liberal democracy. So we think that there might be a more promising candidate for objectionable content than fundamental British values, and something that might be universal. We're hoping. We'd like to find something that would be shared. And so we've already had 2 hours on this, so we're suggesting that a better bet might be rejection of basic morality. So if a view rejects basic morality, a shared kind of universal common morality, and obviously the premise there is assuming that there is such a thing, then this view is extremist because it contains objectionable content. It's rejecting basic morality. So what do we mean by this? Going back to Michael's lecture, it's a set of conflict averting and cooperation sustaining standards necessary for the stability of human social groups. And so these moral standards, there might not be lots and lots and lots of them, they might be a small group of them, but they can include prohibitions on killing and causing harm, stealing and extorting, lying and cheating, requirements to treat others fairly, keeping one's promises and helping those in need. Any view, religious, political or otherwise, that rejects these prohibitions is morally objectionable. And so of course I'm going to give you another couple of minutes just to share with the other people sitting next to you what you think of this first criteria, this first suggestion. Stunned silence. Okay, I'd love to hear a couple of thoughts on this. So a couple of tables or groups who haven't maybe yet spoken. What do you think of this initial idea, this initial criteria?
What if I jumped in on you?
An extremist view is one that rejects a basic morality. Does that sound plausible?
We were just talking about like objectionable to who, and like just we were talking of the example of the repeal the 8th amendment here. To some people that was a very moral argument, yes and no, and to very strong views as well. So it's very difficult to define what's objectionable because it depends what standpoint you're coming from.
Yes, so we've already agreed that it's so tricky with moral standards to say that there seems to be reasonable disagreement among a lot of them. Michael's given a defence as to that there might be some or a select group that we could agree upon because of our need to live together in a community. Is that then the worry that it's the application of this definition? Is that when we look at one particular example, we might say, well, is that going to be an example of an extremist view? So if we agree on the definition, then the job will be trying to see if it works and applying it to specific applied examples or case studies. And I think there will be disagreement about that. So I guess we're still operating at this point is like at the theoretical level. Do you think that this might be something people could sign up to? But then there'll be these cases where we disagree as to whether that's an example of causing harm or not. So that's going to be the tricky thing, is trying to apply it, which is the sort of second level of problem. But yes, that's a great example.
Society changes, like that viewpoint changed over 30 years to being what would have been extremist or absolutely immoral to now being maybe more acceptable, and depends.
Yes.
Like it changes over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think there's another point.
Yeah, just following up on that point and going back to Michael's presentation earlier, it's the justified moral standards that, if that's what we mean there, as opposed to the controversial ones, which will no doubt come up if we've a basic understanding to start out with of morality, then we can build on that, but that would be your bottom line premise.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so with the UK definition, which, as I said, has a role for teachers, it seems that this is the kind of definition that they are aiming at. So in the UK counter-extremism strategy, it says, a range of extremists in the UK promote hatred of others and justify violence, even if they do not act violently themselves. While not directly encouraging participation in violence, which would be illegal, they carefully portray violence as inevitable in achieving the desired end state required by their ideology. Now, what's really interesting here, so again, we're trying to just move away from just what's legal and illegal and look at what's moral and immoral. With the idea of extremism, if they were just saying we're worried about the actions committed, then that falls under kind of criminal notions. We're against the violence that might be perpetrated. Extremism seems to be trying to point to something else, and maybe even an ideology, a way of thinking. There's something else going on here. And with this explanation in part of the extremism strategy here, we can see that one of the worries about this view is that it seems to be overriding a basic moral prohibition on harming others. And so if we can say that even if you don't do anything about that, you're not trying to convince anyone to act on this, or you're not going to act on it yourself, there's something about that view that could be labelled as extreme if it is got objectionable content, in this case overriding a basic shared morality. So that might be one criteria, one offering for the definition of extremism. Is your view extremist? Well, do you share this basic shared morality? If you don't, then it might be considered extreme. So what follows from this hasn't been discussed yet, so just bearing in mind, we're not sort of saying that, we're not sort of advocating thought police or anything just yet, but we're just pausing and saying, well, what's going on here? How would we define this word? So again, in some of the literature which is looking into extremism, we've got this idea here that not all fundamentalists are extremists, nor do all extremists engage in terrorist activities aimed at harming large numbers of people. Fundamentalism, extremism, radicalism, and terrorism are stages in the development of political, religious, and ideological beliefs that build on one another. The role of education is to short-circuit this evolution. And so I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. We're trying to say, well, here we've got all different terms that are indicating not only different sort of ideas and mindsets, but different actions that could follow from that. Is there a role for education then, if extremism is not sharing a subscribed view of certain moral standards, to try and, I guess as we just saw with the lecture on rational moral education, encourage these to be shared and to be understood and justified? So again, I'm really interested in your feedback on this, so I might just give you a couple of minutes to see what you think about this and to share some ideas with me. So. Any feedback on this point? Any thoughts?
Anybody over here?
We were just discussing how scary the last line is. The role of education is to short circuit this evolution. It's quite wow. You know, I would say anyway that it's the role of everyone, youth, community organizations, governments, you know, that's maybe it's just the way it's phrased, but it just feels like a lot, and I do think that we have a part to play in it, but it's such a complex kind of area. And outreach, I suppose my opinion is that outreach is becoming more a part of my job in going out into communities, doing community action things with my students, and really trying to, it's community based and not just school based.
Oh, absolutely. So maybe I've taken this quote out of context. It was particularly looking at what educational roles there might be. And you know, I believe that the authors and myself certainly would agree fully with you. And a lot of the research I've looked at is saying that more effective are community-based outreach organisations, things that can bring people in and make them feel a part of a community, belonging, having their voices heard, things like this, absolutely. And so I wasn't meaning to just end it with it's just the job of the teacher, because particularly in relation to the UK, that's the first time there's officially been a role for educators or schools officially inscribed in the legislation of a Homeland Security document, which is why it is very confronting. And there's been problems with that because there's a lot of assumptions as to that the teachers would be able to recognise and agree on what they're looking out for, what kind of training have they had to do that, and the cases of wrongly reported students, the harm that does on those wrongly reported students is huge. And so, you know, there's the one example that's given of the student that said they live in a terraced house that got reported because they said, I live in a terraced house. And the teacher thought they said terraced house. Don't know if my accent's coming across here. Am I helping? Can you hear the difference? But you know, the kind of the misreporting does so much more damage, and so what I mean, again, going to, you know, what is the role of the educator is something that we're not there yet in terms of our thinking of this, but just getting clear. Do we agree on the definition? Do we agree of what might be worrying or problematic? And then is there a role for teachers? Is we think one of the first steps that we're going to look at. And any other thoughts on this?
Laura, I was actually thinking myself, when I had a very young child say to me at one stage, you go to fire, he said to me, you go to fire. And I think he was trying to say, you go to hell, he was saying to me, you go to fire. Now, because he perceived that I was not of his belief system. So I don't know, I mean, I'm looking at that going, where does that fall in? And for me, then I look back at that now and I don't think I particularly dealt with it very well, but I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know exactly where that falls in.
Yes, and so this is part of the, you know, the dialogue that we wanted to get started is, you know, there's some ambiguities here. And so what we thought we'd do is give a few examples, and of course to try and offer examples that encourage discussion and, you know, are questioning our own assumptions here. So we suggested maybe an extreme view is one that doesn't share common basic morality. Maybe that's an extreme view. Are these people extremists? So we've got some ideas here that one of the things we can expect in the years to come are environmental extremists. And as I said before, obviously the word extremism has been used in lots of different ways. There's political agendas, there's notions of sensationalism, there's a 24-hour news cycle. There's a lot playing into how we use words, which is why it is important to get them right, to define them and use them correctly. With the environmental extremists, I guess the question is, are they really extremists? But if they are, then this is going to contradict our first criteria that we've offered. It seems that our environmental extremists share our common basic morality. And in fact, they are rightly concerned about the environment. They're rightly concerned about what's not being done to help prevent the impacts of climate change and things like that. And then the next question is, well, what do they do about it? And so, are these environmental extremists extremists? And we've got a definition there that's from a website on an American, the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, saying that we should be alert and aware of this next wave of extremists. So again, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to tell each other, and then I'm interested to hear if you think that environmental extremists, are they extremists? And then does that mean our definition isn't working in relation to them? What do you think?
No, you just read out what it says, because we can't read it.
Would you like me to read that out? Okay, so environmental rights extremists view man-made threats to the environment as so severe that violence and property damage are justified to prevent further destruction. Then they've given an example of a couple of groups who adopt a, quote, by any means necessary approach. Although violent tactics such as arson are considered as a last resort, these groups consider acts of property destruction as, quote, non-violent because no human beings or animals are intentional targets. Now this is reminding me of just war theory. They're not intentional. They might be unintentional, collateral damage. But so the quote then here is that these kinds of groups, the ideology adopted is a leaderless resistance model. It has no formal membership. Adherents engage in the destruction of property and criminal activity, such as graffiti, trespassing, vandalism, sabotage, and arson, to inflict economic loss. So, are they extremists? And I'll give you a couple of minutes to discuss that.
Should it be as she said, like the collateral damage? I think it just jars with me. Okay, so are environmental extremists really extremists? They share common basic morality. It might be that, in the name of their cause, they do something that's against the law and they could be appropriately punished by the legal enforcements. But, is this a case of extremism, or is it a case of that they're just being misnamed here? Any thoughts on this? Just hands up. Do you think that these are real extremists? Are they extremists? Yes. Okay, how come? Because of their actions?
Because they are motives, and maybe that goes against basic morality. Even though it was properties, that doesn't account for mental trauma from losing your property or your house.
Okay, so this is really interesting. So their actions, if they're harming property or hurting others, that's a problem.
But then why wouldn't any normal criminal be an extremist? So any normal criminal who's hurting others or damaging property, we might not call them an extremist. They're just disobeying the law. Or
because the extremist is looking for change, so it's a catalyst for change, while a criminal isn't looking for change, that kind of way. So I think we were just discussing what's the difference between an extremist who has a good reason for it, or an extremist who we feel has an immoral reason for it. Is that the...
Okay, so there is something about the ideology. There's something about the belief sets that's going on here, what their intention is perhaps. Yeah. And so then, of course, we've got this question, because if we're saying that, okay, well, it's not a good form of extremism, it's undesirable if they're not adhering to shared basic common morality. But you've just said, well, maybe they are breaking those common moral laws if they're stealing and setting fire to things, damaging property, hurting others. Does that then automatically say that these are bad things, we want to educate against them? When we've got another kind of competing set of moral values at play here, which might be this notion of, okay, well, environmentally, the world really is at a crisis point. If things aren't being done, there's going to be severe repercussions that will cause a lot of harm to a lot of people, and the governments don't seem to be doing enough, and big companies don't seem to be doing enough to do what's needed to stop this. So we've got this question then is, if there's a role for education, does that mean we should try and be helping people to think, oh no, we shouldn't damage property ever, and so we should be trying to educate people not to become environmental extremists? Is that going to be part of the role of education? Yeah.
I just wonder, is there another outlet for people who are so strong in their opinions and their values, and that can cause a greater impact without going down this road of damage and hurting people? And is there a need then for, I just know I feel quite passionate about the environment as well, but I'm but what do I do? Yeah. I'm really frustrated about it, but obviously I don't want to go down this road, but sometimes I think that being on the Green School Committee in school isn't enough.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting point. So this is one example. Let's go on to the second part of the criteria. So our first part of the criteria is that an extremist view is one that rejects a common shared basic morality. The second part is that the view is held with excessive strength. So we've got a lot of ideas and quotes here, and we can go back in philosophy to hear that there's an epistemic duty. We have a duty to be reasonable, to align our belief with the evidence to which affords it. So David Hume saying, a wise man, I'll make that person, proportions their belief to the evidence. It's wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone, to believe something upon insufficient evidence. So where we have evidence and arguments, we should accord how strongly we believe with how much evidence that they have. So the reasonable person will only believe tentatively, or perhaps withhold belief and judgment until there is sufficient evidence upon which to base their belief. Even in science, the notion of fallibilism, the idea that we should always believe something according to the best possible explanation, but be open to new information and understandings coming to light. And then if we're wrong, if we've got it wrong, and we have enough evidence to show us this, we should adjust and try and make our beliefs match the one which we have the most evidence for. So holding views more strongly than the evidence warrants breaches this basic epistemic norm. Holding weakly supported views with great certitude, dogmatism or militancy, is to breach this norm in the extreme or to the utmost extent. On this conception then, extremism is undesirable because it's unreasonable. It's a dereliction of our epistemic duty. And we've got another lovely quote from Desmond Tutu here, where he's saying that extremism is of this kind, the definition that he wants to use. It's when you do not allow for a different point of view, when you hold your own views as being quite exclusive, when you don't allow for the possibility of difference. So there's not just that you have the view, but then you're just not willing to even consider or look at or hear any other points of view at all. So another controversial example, just to see whether or not this is going to help us out, is it extremist to be anti-vaccination? So again, I'm offering you controversial examples. I'm, trying to give examples that aren't religious. But the Federation of European Academies of Medicine say, we need to guard against the spread of misinformation and extremist anti-vaccination groups who may influence those who are on the fence regarding vaccination, negatively affecting public health in the process. Anti-vaccination extremists, according to FEAM, are those who are, quote, unyieldingly entrenched in their refusal to consider vaccine information and often think in terms of conspiracy. If this is a form of extremism, there's not a rejection of basic morality, there's not a rejection of liberal democratic political values. Those things exist, they're shared, but what seems to be happening is that there is a strength, an excessive strength of belief according to the information at hand. So again, just interested to give you a couple of minutes to discuss whether, is this an extremist view and why? Okay, let's just hear a little bit of feedback. Any thoughts on this?
No, just on that point, and I put it out to the table. I'm actually like, the wheel is spinning in my head now. And it's a really good topic, and it's making me think. But I just think, as educators, are we extremists because we're teaching a curriculum that's prescribed by a government that has had moral, questionable laws in the past? You look at the LGBT movement, abortion, divorce, and that's only in the last 20, 30 years. So, and we would have been prescribed to teach that by the curriculum, and we are legally obliged to do that. So, are we facilitating extremism? And then by that, a byproduct, are we extremists? I'm putting it out there. I'm finding it hard to deal with. Sorry.
Okay, so what I'll do is philosophers really like thought experiments because they think that they're helpful. And so instead of, just taking that example and extrapolating a little bit, imagine that you had a totalitarian state that says that, the right thing to do is, let's imagine we're in Westworld or Handmaid's Tale or one of these dystopian, TV series that are very popular. And you had a totalitarian state, and then the educators were asked to enforce views that, you know, didn't allow for a shared common morality to be applied to everyone, and encouraged, you know, indoctrinated, strongly held beliefs of particular kinds that, you know, could have been discriminatory, then it seems that that sort of education system, on our view, would be extremist. It would be not allowing for these basic moral tenets that we think are necessary. So what's interesting is that if we're looking at what educators try and do and what governments try and do these days, if they're saying, okay, well, we want everyone to agree that there are sort of shared moral norms and that their citizens are reasonable, that they're able to freely and democratically make their choices that, you know, affects policies and, you know, who's in charge and things like that. That's what they're aiming at. So we could say, okay, if that's the case, then that's a good thing. It's another question. It's a separate question of whether they do that, whether it's always happening, whether it's consistent, or whether that one specific example is discriminatory, and what's the difference between discrimination and extremism. So these are really, I think, important questions that we should look at. And then each citizen, we want them to educate to, you know, to be reasonable and to reflect on the evidence, and then say, when there is a vote that comes up, do we keep or change this law? That they are able to say, well, does it inclusively protect the rights of every single person? Does it allow for reasonableness? You know, these kinds of things. And we'd ideally want them to vote in favour of reasonable laws. It doesn't always happen in a democracy. That's why we offered the challenge to the fundamental British values at the start there. But each specific example can be challenged on those grounds, absolutely. But if, insofar as we're aiming at this, and theoretically we say that this is what we want, that's a good starting point. It's never going to be perfect in practice.
This has just been handed to me. We were talking here about, you know, the linking of extremism and looking for evidence. We went back to the vaccination one, and we were talking about that whole polarization of information that we're all getting. You know, if you want to, if you have a right-wing view, you read all the kind of right-wing newspaper maybe, and your podcast feed and your Twitter feed, and you're getting more and more, all of your information, you're kind of reassured, this is right, this is my correct point of view. So I suppose in terms, going back to teachers, are we extremists? Like, okay, you can look at the evidence, you look at the research done along a particular point of view, and then you take it on. And, you know, are we being fed an approach the whole time, and we're taking it on as being correct, and we slap ourselves on the back, or clap ourselves on the back and say, oh yeah, you know, this is the correct way to go because this evidence points this direction. Like, you know, the point I'm making, I suppose, is that we're constantly being bombarded with media, but we select what we listen to. In education as well, we select, you know, the views coming from whatever different research. We select what we want to read, what we're interested in. So going back to our vaccination one, I suppose to simplify it, if you want to be anti-vaccination, you'll find plenty of information out there for your point of view, but to reflect on evidence, and that's where the teacher comes in, maybe, that we have all points of views and then we reflect on it, that we don't just stick with the one route. Sorry, does that make sense? It's kind of that it's that polarization of information, and that's probably the biggest for me, I think, going forward with children. They're all feeding in what they want to believe, and they have evidence, and they have heard it from here, and, you know, we're heading down that route. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. This is actually exactly the topic that I wrote my book on. So I wrote a book called Media and Moral Education, A Philosophy of Critical Engagement. And it's absolutely true that the way we get information these days has changed, and the way that young people are getting information has changed, and the social media echo chamber is a very real thing, and it's very influential and persuasive in a way that we might have been worried about previously, pre the kind of technology that we have and the interactive social media. We were worried about silos of people who just reinforce a certain kind of belief without getting into dialogue, encountering views that are different to their own, being able to weigh them up against each other and see where the evidence falls. But with the online social media, there's so many more invisible tools that are helpful, that guide your pre-existing biases to be reinforced. And so in the work that I've recently published, actually going back to the claim that was made before, it's not just the role of teachers. I think that there's a very important role for education, but we also need to be supported by companies and governments and policies that allow for, you know, checking as to what is happening in the online space, which of course, because it's so pervasive and global, it's very difficult to police and navigate. And the fact that, you know, anyone who programs these things, their implicit biases are being fed into. I mean, AI is a great example. When you have AI that suddenly is sexist and racist, we're saying, well, it's not that it spontaneously becomes sexist and racist. There's been inherent biases in the programming at some level that results in these kinds of views coming out of an AI. So I think that, you know, the notion of, what is moderated, forums that are not fully open, you know, where are the protected safe spaces, that's vitally important. And so for me, that step back first for education is we need to find a way to give these students the tools to look for other points of view, look at other evidence and try and weigh them up to see which ones hold water and which ones don't, to engage respectfully with views that differ from their own, so that at least then they have a chance of encountering other ideas and considering how to respond to them. And of course, that's all a part of your ethical education curriculum as well. But
I was just going to say about that, just to go back to the vaccination thing, I think it's an interesting case history because for a number of reasons. Because initially the anti-vax people were given lots of opportunity and had got a lot of traction in terms of what they believed and all their worries and concerns. And it was based, a lot of it was based on false information by a doctor who's been discredited since, struck off. And then the scientific community came back with all the real information. And so with misinformation, there does come a point when I think somebody is justified, society is justified in saying, no, too many children's lives are being put at risk. And the time has come now to say, sorry, that is not acceptable and doesn't have a sufficient scientific background or basis. So I think in terms of education and then schools and children and coming into the school, I think teachers in that instance have an obligation to make sure the other children are protected and society generally is protected. So there are cases when it is necessary to step in, and when the information and the scientific community all come together, there is a time when it's not censorship, it's not clamping down, it's actually being realistic.
Yes, thank you. And I think that, I mean, I wouldn't like to speak for him, but I think with Michael's point of view, he would say, well, this isn't a controversial issue, it's not up for debate. There is sufficient evidence to say this has been settled. It's you know, a closed issue. And you know, we actually see legislation, I don't know about here, but in Australia, where if your child's unvaccinated, you can't go into kindergartens and shared playgroups any longer. But of course, the counter argument is, you know, parental choice in a domestic space. Can they choose what to do? They still can, but there are sort of, as you say, societal decisions and ramifications or consequences of that.
Sorry, just as you spoke, I was thinking as teachers, something we can do, and it seems like another kind of word I was thinking of when we speak of extremism, and it's really interesting to get the positive perspective as well as, you know, the only thing I've ever heard about extremism is the negative. And another word that kind of really hit me was passion, and this kind of dogmatic belief that you are right. So I kind of feel as a teacher, something I've learned, and I would do a lot of debating, but I feel like that's the key and that's the secret in encouraging children to feel comfortable on a regular basis to debate and to know that it's a safe space and it's okay to disagree, and to learn from a young age how to communicate their point, and more importantly, I suppose, how to listen to the other side without taking offence, without shutting the conversation down. And I think that's really huge. Like,
yes, thank you. And I'll get on to a couple of pedagogical thoughts that I've got shortly as well. So just coming back to then the two criteria we've got, the definition that we're offering as a starting point, as a working definition to see how we go with it. Our definition is educationally remediable, in principle at least. Views that reject basic morality could be tackled by helping students to understand why basic morality is important, the reasons, the justifications for that. You know, you could give a defence such as Michael gave, that conflict averting and cooperation sustaining standards are needed in human social groups, separate to or in addition to any other sort of normative ethical theory that defends either using rights language or consequences or character, things like that. And that, secondly, the holding of views with unwarranted certitude can be tackled by helping students with their critical thinking to understand why it's important to proportion their beliefs to the evidence, to be open-minded to new evidence and opinions and points of view that come to them, and to weigh these up rationally, to engage with views other than their own, and to see which ones are going to be the most reasonable in accordance with the evidence that they have. So if we have this definition, there's something that we can do, at least, in the classroom as moral educators. One of the things that seems very important, and I think that a few of you have actually touched on this as well though, and Michael mentioned this in his lecture, morality and these kinds of things are not just about what you think, especially morality is so important because it affects our behaviour and how we actually do things together in the world. And this has not just a cognitive element, but also an affective or an attitudinal and behavioural aspects to it. There's a psychological aspect here. So something that's going to be effective in this space, in the educational domain, needs to be more than just cognitive. I mean, the example that someone said of caring is sharing, okay, well, I know that that's right, I just don't care, I'm not going to do it. I know that that's what I'm meant to do, but I'm not interested in actually following that. This is exactly the kind of gappiness problem where I know the right thing, but how do I connect it to actual action or caring about it? So addressing objectionable content extremism is going to involve taking steps to strengthen both students' subscription to basic morality and their understanding of what justifies it. So subscribing to basic morality isn't just a matter of knowing, this is the rule I've been told, but if you're going to internalise it, you have to have an understanding of why that's justified and that I feel it's appropriate. So, in order to guide my actual action, there has to be some emotional aspect to that. I have to be inclined to do it. And addressing excessive strength extremism will involve some kind of notion of how much passion is too much passion, perhaps, to sort of steal your word there, but helping people and students to regulate their emotional attachment to the views they hold in order to be open to considering other views, to checking how much evidence they really have to support their view, whether it's reasonable or not. And so this isn't going to be fixed just at the purely intellectual level. There has to be some kind of, I guess, not just emotion that's tied into this, but then the right kinds of habits of action, the kind of practices and behaviours that follow. So given that human beings are motivated by reasons and swayed by emotions, educational responses to the problem of extremism has to include both cognitive and affective elements. Otherwise, I just don't think it's going to work. So education that's aiming at reasonableness as well as motivating the right kinds of emotions that are in conflict with, say, violent extremism and extremism ideologies needs to have some elements of a cognitive and attitudinal elements. And so it's not going to be enough that people think that they know what the right thing to do is or can mimic and say, well, this is the right thing to do. We're also worried about what's actually done and what habits they put into practice. So some of the questions we're interested in and look forward to discussing with you is if you think that this kind of definition that we've got is a good starting point. Is it going to help us to then consider what might be able to be done in the educational space? If we have a definition of extremism that is looking at this 2 criteria, how is it going to be useful? What are going to be problems with it? Is there anything that we've missed? Is there anything that we need to put on the table and consider? If we think that extremism is something that rejects a basic common shared morality or is beliefs that are held with too much strength, then this is something that we can say is undesirable. We could do things to educate against it. This might be useful. The examples of this, as we've already seen, are controversial and they're going to promote dialogue. But is this a useful starting point, do you think? And so I've got some pedagogical suggestions that come after this, but I am interested in a little bit of feedback at this point. So I'll give you maybe 3 minutes to talk amongst your tables, and then I'll be interested to hear some of your thoughts if there's something that's missing so far from this definition. Thank you, that's a good point. Okay, if I can have your attention again. Thank you. Okay, so to remind you of the working definition that we've offered you. So extremism is a view that has content that's objectionable, doesn't share a common basic morality, or is held too strongly with too much certitude, dogmatism and militancy, so that it's not in proportional accordance with the evidence given. Some feedback, some thoughts on this definition. Do you think that it's helpful? Do you think it's going to do some of the work that we need? Is there anything that we've missed? Is there anything that's particularly glaring for you?
apologise if I'm oversimplifying it, but when their content is in some way objectionable, that means it will be moderate, as we discussed earlier. But if people didn't object to anything, obviously we wouldn't get change. So I guess that part for me is just so simple.
So
and we have many, many examples.
So let me just see if I understand you. So, for example, let's say that we agree that we need to do something about the environment. This is a real problem, and let's say that the governments, the policymakers, the people in positions of power, especially the big companies, they're not doing anything, and so we should do something extreme in order to get their attention to try and make change. Is this the kind of suggestion?
Yeah, I think it takes people to sacrifice both themselves and unfortunately other people's lives, maybe directly and indirectly, to get change. People who go on hunger strike for very specific reasons, which can result in change coming around.
The question then is, you're still saying that that's a version of extremism. You're just saying that maybe sometimes it's needed, or maybe sometimes
exactly. Sorry. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I kind of concur with what Jessica said a little while ago about that to eliminate extremism, which is, I think, what we're talking about trying to do. Is that what?
Well, this is the other question. So we're trying to say, is there a version of extremism we should educate against?
Make some mistakes, by the way.
The context comes out of, in particular, if the government is saying we need to educate against extremism, the worry seems to be framed in all kinds of political ways, which might be to short circuit the transition from extremism into terrorism. Yeah. And so this is there are some particular forms of terrorism and extremism that they've got in mind that's sort of not said. And
yes,
sometimes
and it hasn't been mentioned here really at all very much today.
That's right. So I've been deliberately not mentioning it to try and get at the definition to see if it works. And one of the things, I noticed even when I was looking at the Irish, the government's policies, when they were first talking about trying to stop extremism and terrorism, they specifically had in mind the IRA. They're not just talking general terms, and now that's actually been broadened out because they're concerned and worried about other forms. So I was trying to bracket that to see if there's a definition that works. And then it's another question of, is absolutely every form of extremism undesirable, as we said at the very beginning, or
I think you asked us to just say what we may think about those two.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, I think that number one is too Orwellian and closed circuit TVs on everybody and not allowing us to actually say what we think. That's just my
that's really interesting, because the next bit I wanted to, before I ran out of time, was to go to the pedagogy of it, because what follows from this is a separate question. And what follows it, like if the example that I'm going to give and get to would be the opposite to closing down dialogue. It'd be the opposite to, closely monitoring what everyone does. It'd be opening up dialogue, inviting relationship, inviting understanding and, differences to try and, and that might be, you might say, well, that's naive or things like that. But what follows from it for you is, it's restrictions and policing. Then that might be a concern to the reaction. What do we do about it?
And sorry, somebody should take the microphone away from me, by the way. And nobody has. Oh, you tried. But like, if we and again, I'm just trying to figure it out. I think we're all thinking a lot today. I certainly am. It's hard. And number one, if we take Northern Ireland for an example, and the Equality Bill, or the Equal Rights for Marriage, which isn't currently there, which is here in the Republic. If people were not objecting right now up there, like if they wouldn't, given that this might be a UK applicable situation, if they objected to not being allowed to marry, they might come under the term extreme, right?
Oh, but that's not the definition we were using. So that definition was against rule of law, and we're saying law isn't always going to match onto shared common basic morality. So for us,
but I'm just coming back to
law is
one.
wider anyway,
okay.
but it's going to law covers more things than shared basic morality, and so on our definition we'd be talking about equal rights and things like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Too. So just what you were saying that we talked earlier about, kind of that your beliefs or your morals are related to kind of the reasonableness that you can justify and there's evidence. So for me, I'm just thinking about religion and there mightn't be evidence. So are we putting a lot of people in the category of extremists? If they're religious, if they hold any religious view that they can't back up by evidence, then are they in the category of being an extremist?
Yeah, so this is another good question. I had actually just spoken to Michael to see if he wanted to jump in on the question and answer before I talked to you about some of the pedagogical suggestions that I have, because this was our working definition. But did you want to answer that kind of question?
So I think it all depends on how much certitude. So no, we're definitely not looking to exclude religion, right? I think lots of religious positions are extremely persuasive and compelling and attractive, and we're definitely not trying to suggest to children that religion is unreasonable per se. But I think probably we'd all recognise that some forms of religion, or religion sometimes becomes extreme. And so it's kind of the point at which it becomes extreme. So the idea of holding with too much dogmatism or militancy is about saying it's not that it's wrong to hold a belief that goes beyond the evidence, because we do that whenever we take a step of faith, and we're not saying faith is a bad thing. We do that when we commit ourselves to a relationship that may or may not work out. We kind of believe that it's going to work out, and sometimes we're going against the evidence there. So it's not bad to take steps of faith in life. That's not the point. The point is that sometimes we go too far. We hold with too much dogmatism or militancy. We're absolutely certain that some highly contested view is right, and we're prepared to defend that in extreme or objectionable ways. And that's the point at which you've slipped into extremism.
Thank you. Religious education expert there, so I thought I'd bring him in on that one. So I'd like to skip forward. So I think that we are open to, more of your feedback and to more of the examples where you think this, is going to work or not work, and what you think about it, because we are at the very beginning stages of this project, and we've actually just got a new PhD student who's going to be starting with us in September, who's looking at whether P4C, philosophy for children, can play a role in helping to educate against extremism. And so on that, I had just a couple of thoughts, which Michael may or may not subscribe to. At this point, the joint presentation becomes, here are some of Laura's ideas, just so that he's not necessarily wedded to some of my thoughts here. But one of the things that I hinted at before, and something that I'm very interested in, and has a couple of people have mentioned, is that certainly human beings are not always reasonable. Now, it's the job of educators to be trying to educate for reasonableness. I think that that's absolutely crucial, and critical thinking is central to this. But I think that there's also something about what kinds of appropriate emotions and dispositions towards others should we be trying to encourage and facilitate the practice of, so that they become habits. And the debate, I think that there's, I'm imagining that there's quite a divide in the room about this notion of compassion. So, a few people had said, I just don't think we can be caring and compassionate towards all other people around the globe, that's asking way too much of us, and it's just not possible. But I certainly think that there are certain habits and practices for reasonable engagement with others that is helping us to practice being caring and compassionate towards others, so that we can radically disagree with them even, but still respect them as persons, and respect, that we should be caring towards them. What that actually looks like in practice, what that means, is up for debate. But what I find interesting about this notion then is that compassion has a cognitive element. So it's not just purely emotional. There's something, a recognition that others, even for all of our differences, that human beings have more in common than they have different. Which, when we're faced with certain kinds of people and beliefs that really trigger us, can be easy to forget. But the idea that we might be able to put ourselves in the shoes of others, that practices that encourage this are really important and useful, and they go alongside and hand in hand with the kind of critical thinking skills that we're trying to educate. And some of the suggestions in the ethical education curriculum that you've got offer a lot of these great strategies, and so I'm sure that people are trying different versions of them, but even a lot of the techniques from drama, where you're inhabiting different roles and playing with perspectives, I think can
can be used in this way. And so, you know, the idea that, you know, we're trying to get people to see others not as other, as in not like me, and, you know, somehow less than human in this sense. We need to find approaches in the classroom that encourage us to be able to see them as like ourselves, even when we're allowed to disagree. And I think that an important aspect of this then, which I know you've had other amazing talks on during this summer school, include revisiting stories and narratives. What are the stories and the stereotypes that we tell and retell? What do we like, share and perpetuate, especially on social media? What are we reinforcing? What are the assumptions that we're not pausing and critically engaging with and thinking about? And so in the book that I wrote, that's one example where I think we should bring those concepts into the classroom. So yes, things are happening online, but if we pause and say, well, what kind of images and stereotypes are we, especially gender norms, all kinds of things, are we trying to, you know, influence these young students are getting influenced by them? Can we pause and deconstruct it a little bit? Can we, you know, bring the conversation into dialogue, which obviously requires that safe space? And so I defend a position I call critical perspectivism. So it's an attitude that says we need to be critical, but we also need to be compassionate. And deciding, you know, how we do that is going to be contextual. It's going to be situated at a time, in a place. And another great example that was given earlier was, you know, at what point do we shut kids up? When something is being discussed, at what point do we intervene a bit more in the discussion and try and protect and stop harm from occurring based on the knowledge we have as teachers, based on how much we know our group? That's not something that I think is always easy to just say there's a, you know, a general rule that's applied. Sometimes it requires that situational discernment where we make an all things considered judgment in that place, in that time. But what I think is needed, not just by the students actually, but by teachers, is to practice this engagement. And so with a pedagogical approach, it isn't just about knowing, oh, I need to try and prevent harm, oh, how do I do that? Sometimes I'm going to need to silence kids. It's about being a part of dialogues that might deal with controversial issues yourself as well. And so one way to do this, and by looking at these narratives, is using the community of inquiry, which is the pedagogy practiced by proponents of philosophy in schools. And again, this is just one suggestion amongst many. And so, you know, it's a great example because you're all in circles, you're all in communities of inquiry now. And the idea here is that with Philosophy for Children, they recognise that it's not just about thinking skills, it's also about how we respond to others as persons with whom we can disagree, but we're trying to move towards truth together as a community, as a group. And again, then there's going to be another question as to, like, we might be able to do this perfectly in the classroom, but how does that translate to behaviour outside of the classroom, into the playground, into the real world? You know, you get lots of examples of well-functioning P4C schools and classes where, oh, they might do respectful dialogue brilliantly for 1 hour a week in their P4C class. How do we get that to translate to how they're dealing with disagreement then in the playground? Or even other more difficult questions, when they take those techniques back to home and home doesn't have that kind of dialogue, then what do they do? Because they're, you know, in a situation where in some cases they could educate parents, they could open up dialogues in the home, but that could be very confronting. They could feel more alienated from the way that conversations are usually conducted in their domestic space. And so I don't have all the answers for this, obviously, but in terms of this kind of engagement requires us to actually practice it as opposed to just, you know, think we know the right thing to do. And with the community of inquiry, the idea here is that we're aiming at the well-being of the members of the group in intellectual, moral and affective terms, not just one. And participating in this kind of dialogue allows students individually and collaboratively to develop their own ideas and perspectives based on appropriately rigorous modes of thinking and against the background of a thorough understanding and appreciation of those ideas and perspectives that, having stood the test of time, may be represented as society's best views of things to date. And I think that this is helpful because, for example, if we go back to our example of the shared common morality,
it means we can still have a discussion about stealing. I mean, obviously we do, and I'm sure that you do in the ethics classes. And we have the discussion about, well, when is it okay to steal? When is it okay to lie? But some of the assumptions that can be investigated and explored in the dialogue makes us realise that the reason we can have those discussions about that tricky case is because the assumption is that we shouldn't steal, that we shouldn't lie, that we have shared moral values as a community that are required in order for us to live and work well together. And so I think that the moral dilemmas don't show that all morality is relative or subjective. I think actually it shows that, generally speaking, there are shared common human ideas, but what we disagree in is the application. There's specific examples that are very heated and controversial, and there's reasonable disagreement with so many of these examples. But if we can find a way to have a dialogue about it, we're not going to change everyone's mind. We're not going to get everyone on the same page, but hopefully we can find a way to at least encourage more of adopting the other person's point of view, which I think is helpful. I think it can move us in the right direction. Now, I don't want to be naive and say, oh, community of inquiry is the solution to all of the world's problems. I've seen presentations where people say that, and I think that we need to be modest in our claims and what we're aiming at. But I think a good starting point is to open up discussion that is respectful. And I think that when we start to see how much of the rhetoric and the discussions and dialogues and debates that aren't out there in the world, if we look at how politicians are mudslinging at each other, ads that are, tearing each other down whenever there's election time, they're just committing ad hominem attacks all the time. But if, we sort of encourage this way of dialogue that is then started to be represented in the society, I think that's a good thing to do, at least. I am out of time, so I'm going to pause there, and I think I've got, 2 minutes, if there's any sort of burning questions for right now. Otherwise, you can mob me after lunch, but let me eat something first. But are there any questions? I think we've got time for 2 questions before we break for food, unless everyone's absolutely starving, of course.
I found the presentation really interesting, and I'm learning a lot from it. But the worry still is that it's the providence, I think, of bringing extremism or dealing with extremism in the classroom. It's from the state that's worried about itself and the effects of terrorism. Now, they could be saying that they're worried about their citizens, but in fact, they're identifying the citizens as suspects. And I think there is an issue in that itself, and we have to be careful here because there's a boundary issue here between what the role of a teacher is, as distinct from what the role of a police person is.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think in the PREVENT programme and other programmes like that, we have crossed the boundary, because the teachers are now obliged to report any possibility that the student is living within a culture of terrorism, and it just under the same idea as you report abuse. It's for their benefit, apparently, but in fact the truth of it is it's for the benefit of the state to identify and wheedle out pockets of terrorism around the place. So I think we have to be very careful about that boundary there, and whether we are now becoming police within the system or not. But I agree with all the ideas about the community of inquiry, hugely important, compassionate education, hugely important. There's some good examples here from Northern Ireland under the Children Crossfire, but I think that it is a very, very important issue that you raised today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's just finish on that note, shall we?
Just a really quick thank you again to Laura and to Michael for a really stimulating, thought-provoking session, lots of questions. It's really nice, I think, as ethical education teachers to actually get a chance to engage in ethical education ourselves, where we're presented with ideas and, you know, kind of controversial topics and asked, you know, ourselves, so that we're again put into the position of our students and, you know, experiencing all of the emotions and the thinking that goes along with that. So thank you very much to both of you. Okay, at this stage I'd like to welcome our guests for lunch across the way, and our primary school teachers will follow us shortly. They just have to